Actually, we have enough examples here that I'm going to go through this example as well. And just kind of give you an overview of how I would have made recommendations here. And then we'll go on to another, going through the exercise of all of you making your own recommendations. So if you look at this, this report, so this is on tomatoes, July 20th. July 20th, I would anticipate this crop is probably 2 feet to 30 inches tall and just beginning to size fruit. Has maybe the first 2 or 3 sets of fruit is beginning to size and fill. Would that be approximately correct?
There was some fruit, green fruit showing.
Some green fruit on the plants already. Okay, so
This is in a high tunnel situation.
this is high tunnels. Thank you. So if we look at the sugar numbers, sugar number levels are 1.1 and 0.7. I'm not really satisfied with where these are. I would want them to be substantially higher. And these plants, remember, these plants are on the opposite end of the cycle from where the strawberries were. These plants are just starting to fill fruit. We need them to be charging under a full head of steam. They need to be going 90 miles an hour. We cannot have them slow down at all. So I'm not satisfied with where the sugar levels are. I want them to be approximately double of where they are right now. If we look at the pHs, pHs are at 6.0 and 5.7. The laboratory is reporting 6.0 as being generous to adequate. I have a question mark about the validity of that. In our own experience, we still like to see them at 6.4. EC levels are moderate to low, and that's possibly part of the reason why the sugar levels are low. We're going to find that one of the electrolytes is on the low side. That's why the EC is low on the new leaves. It could be nitrogen, it could be magnesium, could be chloride, could be a number of different things, reasons why that EC is low, but we'll discover it on further down. If we look at the potassium levels, yes?
We would expect the sugars to be hot in an ideal situation to be higher in the older leaf?
Not necessarily. There should be good sugar. The sugars levels in the old versus the new should be fairly comparable. There should not be a lot of variation. If there is a lot of variation, that means that the sugars are not being transported correctly. If we look at the potassium levels, we have 4160 in the old, 3520 in the new. It's bad news for this stage of plant development because these plants are already, it's July the 20th, they're starting to fill green fruit and they're already running out of potassium. They already have a potassium deficiency because the potassium, they're already sabotaging the lower older leaves and moving potassium up into the upper leaves of the upper part of the plant. So if this were a crop that I were responsible for managing and making recommendations for, I would be making recommendations for aggressive potassium applications starting immediately, both foliar and irrigation system. We would be putting on very aggressive potassium applications. If we look at the potassium levels, potassium is 2560 on the new, which is moderate to slightly low, and 6620 on the old. Now, this is a really high number on the old, which would be an indicator to me that we have had really high temperatures. We had a lot of heat stress on these plants. It's a really high heat stress, and because of all that respiration, we had a lot of water moving through the older leaves, and so we had this accumulation of calcium in the lower older leaves. It's somewhat of a fake number. So I'm more concerned about the calcium levels and the new growth because the deficiencies are going to show up in the new growth first. We're not at the point yet where we're going to have blossom end rot. We're going to have blossom end rot when we have potassium, a potassium to calcium ratio greater than 2.5. And right now we have, on the new leaves, we had a ratio of 1.6. So we're in good condition at this point. However, that's about to change if we don't change the calcium and the potassium fairly quickly. If we look at the magnesium levels, magnesium is 524, 526. The plant is fairly well balanced. How did you guys manage to get magnesium exactly identical on both strawberries and tomatoes? Is there something magic about Minnesota?
I'm not sure what's happening there. Two totally different farms.
So again, I would, because the magnesium is well balanced, but it is on the low side of the desired range, and so I would put on a magnesium application as a foliar just to see where it went in the plant. Does it go to the old leaves or does it go to the new? And you'll be able to see 2 weeks later with a follow-up sap analysis. Sodium levels, low side of moderate, not a problem. Would not put on anything additional there. Ammonium levels are really high, 268 and 394. And again, this speaks to what we were just talking about with the very aggressive photorespiration and high temperature conditions in the high tunnels. So we have this ammonium accumulation happening in the leaf. Nitrate levels are at 182 and 1820. Now, I don't have to go any further. I look at the combination of the high levels of ammonium, the high levels of nitrate, and I would be very comfortable making the prediction that if this crop does not already have aphids or whiteflies or some type of insects and leaf mold, then it is quite likely going to have them in the next couple of weeks if something doesn't change pretty quickly. So our goal, and so then we move on down to the total nitrogen number. We have a total nitrogen of 1,154 versus 1,379. So for this, the nitrogen is one of those elements that is highly mobile. It moves around very quickly, very readily. So even though the laboratory is telling us that this nitrogen supply is on the lower end of the spectrum, I'm really not too concerned about it. And I think that this plant still has adequate levels of nitrogen because it is telling us that it has more than it needs, and it's putting the extra downstairs in the lower older leaves because the older leaves are 200 parts per million higher than the new leaves at the top. Yes?
On the ammonium portion of the nitrogen, is there how would you address that extreme?
I'm going to come back through this and make recommendations for everything that we would do once I've finished with the comments. So chlorides are in the high to moderate range. No comments. Sulfur is on the low side, and because this is one of the elements that is not highly mobile, but it is moderately mobile, it does move around, and so we're seeing sulfur be much lower in the new leaves than in the old leaves, and even the old leaves are on the lower end of the spectrum. And so this low sulfur level is one of the reasons why we have the high nitrates. As soon as you have sulfur levels dropping, and I would expect when we get down to molybdenum, we'll see molybdenum is also low. So remember, we have the trio, magnesium, sulfur, and molybdenum. You address those three, and that nitrate level will disappear very, very quickly. Phosphorus levels, 263 and 367. The plant has higher levels on the old than on the new, and so even though this is on the lower end of the spectrum, I'm not too concerned yet about phosphorus at this point, but I would be paying very close attention to it, and if it dropped any further on the new leaves, I would start applying phosphorus as a foliar spray to try to bring that back up. Silicon levels are really good, which I'm happy to see, and that would lead me to suspect that we probably have had really strong biostimulants applied in the irrigation system to really drive silicon availability. Iron levels are not limiting crop growth at this point. They could stand being a bit higher, but I'm not too concerned about them. Manganese is on the low side, and again, I am a big manganese fan because of the results that I have seen manganese deliver. So my desired value for manganese is about 20 parts per million on tomatoes, which is, it's not in the handout, but that number is available online. And so because they're saying that 13 and 17 parts per million is adequate, I would actually like to see a little bit more, and I would continue putting on a manganese application. Zinc levels are definitely on the low side. And depending on, so here we have an interesting situation in which both zinc and phosphorus are low. So if this is in a high tunnel and we have phosphorus that has soil that has adequate levels of phosphorus, then where a lot of compost was applied or a lot of manure was applied or whatever might be the case, this would be a situation where it might be possible to put on a foliar application of zinc and get a very strong phosphorus response, get a very strong response in phosphorus uptake.
Excuse me, Gerald, they are putting on a bit of zinc through the drip.
They were putting zinc on through the drip? but for whatever reason it was not being absorbed. Yep. That's because you weren't using AEA zinc.
Yeah. Or
or
Agro K.
Agro K zinc. So if we look at the boron levels are adequate. Anything, tomatoes is about 3 to 7 parts per million is fine, so I'm not too concerned about that. Copper levels are adequate to generous, which is really good because it's very directly associated with bacterial spot, bacterial speck resistance. So I'm happy with these copper levels. But then we look at molybdenum, and again, molybdenum is really, really low. So moly, and so when I look at all of this, okay, the first step in making recommendations is providing the antidote to all the excesses. So what are the major excesses? The major excess that really shows up very clearly is ammonium. That's the major one, and the second one is nitrate. So I want to address those two first. Those are the first two pieces that I'm going to pay attention to. So for the ammonium, I want to address ammonium, I want to really drive photosynthesis and get a higher sugar level so we have more carbon to buffer out and tie up with that nitrogen for protein synthesis. So I'm going to address all of the photosynthetic nutrients, magnesium, phosphorus, or not phosphorus, but magnesium, manganese, iron that we talked about. So we have adequate levels of manganese, we have adequate levels of iron, or when I say adequate levels of manganese, I said that I want more, but we don't have enough manganese deficiency to slow down photosynthesis right now, but we are low on magnesium. So magnesium needs to be addressed to drive photosynthesis so that it reduces ammonium. And secondly, that's one. And the second is, as I shared in the discussion about ammonium, I would also add a small amount of nickel. So I would put in a nickel application as well. Then we look at the nitrate levels. We have high levels of nitrate, and our magnesium levels could deserve to be boosted, as well as the sulfur, as well as the boron. So I would address all three of those, magnesium, sulfur, and boron. So the first four nutrients that need to be a part of this foliar spray are magnesium, sulfur, boron, nickel. Those first four are the first four that need to be addressed. Then we look at addressing the deficiencies that are showing up. Not quite yet at the stage where I would consider putting on aggressive calcium applications, but I definitely would be keeping my eye on it. And of course, I'm making all these comments based on a single piece of paper, a single snapshot in time. If you're an agronomist or a farm manager, then you will know a little bit of the history. You'll know that historically you've had blossom end rot problems and you need to address calcium. Or you will know that you have soil that has very good calcium availability and you don't really need to address calcium. You'll know kind of the rest of the story that I'm just making a bunch of assumptions about. Additional deficiencies that I would address immediately. I am concerned about phosphorus. I would leave that for another week, another 2 weeks maybe, to see what the sap analysis results says before I started addressing that. But in particular, you need to foliar apply manganese and zinc. Both manganese and zinc are substantially less than I would like to see them at this point. And so I would also apply manganese and zinc as a foliar, and whatever zinc you've been using in the drip irrigation system is not working, so get a different form and put it on as a foliar, not in the drip irrigation system. Yes?
Just looking at this, we've got fruit starting to size up.
Yep.
So, and you've identified potassium as being an issue. We've also got calcium being a bit of an issue, because we had that artificial earlier, probably because of dry weather, but
right.
Overall the new tissue is looking low on calcium.
Yep.
Are we going to want to be careful with that potassium to not overdo it and start bulking the cells up too far without enough calcium there to give integrity?
Manganese is the magic wand here.
Okay.
I would, again, if I knew more of the history, I would consider, and actually I missed potassium in my recommendations, I would consider also including potassium here, either in the irrigation system or in the foliar or both. However, if you have high potassium soils, simply addressing manganese is going to allow that potassium level to come up all on its own. It's also going to moderate calcium. So,
You mentioned that earlier.
yes. So that would be my preferred treatment. That's the one that is going to be the most cost effective for the farmer. It's going to provide the healthiest crop, and it's going to give him the biggest impact if it works. And the agronomist is going to know what's the soil type here, what's the soil history, what are the mineral levels in the soil, and they'll have a very good idea about whether that methodology will work or not. Now, if you have low potassium soils, if I were to look at this and say, okay, we have low potassium levels here in the sap analysis. The plant is starting to run out, it's filling fruit, and we have sandy soils that have 1.5% potassium in the CEC, and they have that translates to 75 parts per million. I would be putting on 15 pounds of potassium per week in the irrigation system right now. I would not hesitate.
Because of the stage, you're not really at this point going to do too much with calcium, or?
Calcium is trending low,
Yeah.
and so I might consider it, but I also might not. And again, there's the soil background that I don't know about. Is this a soil that delivers a lot of calcium, or does it not? And if it doesn't, then I would consider addressing calcium also.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the antagonistic nature between the two of them?
They're both on the low side right now, so neither one of them is anywhere close to being a surplus.
Yeah, so put them both on.
Yep,
Okay.
put both of them on.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, so now let's switch to the fun stuff. We're going to flip back one more page. Oh, no, that's no good. 2 more pages. Rocky Top, tomatoes, 8/17 is the date. I think it is, yes, it's the very last page in the handout. So now I would like for you to, for everyone to split up into groups per table, or 2 tables if there's only 2 people per table, 3 or 4 people per group. When the number gets up to 5, the conversations start becoming a lot more difficult. So about 3 or 4 people per group. And I'd like for you to go through this SAP analysis, and then based on the pieces that we discussed on the last 2 analysis, I would like for you as a group to look at this test and to make recommendations for what you think needs to be applied. So you can list out your recommendations, and then we're going to come back together as a group and we're going to discuss the recommendations that you've made, what the differences are, and how you might have made recommendations differently. We're just going to talk about it.
Now with the date, I'm thinking we're starting to see some colored fruit on the, we're seeing harvest at this point.
I would expect so. So this is August 17. You're probably in the 1st or 2nd picking, something like that. Yep. So the one thing that I would like to point out, just as a disclaimer, there is more than one right way to make agronomy recommendations. There's more than one way to do something right. There's also more than one way to do something wrong as well. But there is more than one way to make the correct recommendations. So I would say make these recommendations. Don't need to be super detailed. They're not that complicated. It's not that complicated to put these together. So why don't you guys get started? We're going to give you 20 minutes, and at the end of 20 minutes, we're going to have a discussion, and I'll come back together again as a group. All right. You guys have got it all figured out by now?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Happy to hear that. I'm going home. All right. So, an interesting sample for you guys to look at. I think you've had the chance to have some really good discussions. So, what are your, now that you've had a chance to discuss it and look at it, what are your recommendations? What do you think needs to be applied to this crop? Anyone want to take a stab at it and go first? Nobody wants to. Go ahead.
We're going to take a stab at it, but the question came up, this is getting later in the season, and how much do we want to invest at this point in the season, and what we do now, is it going to affect the crop, the overall crop?
So it's August 17th. You're in a high tunnel. I would say you probably still have an additional, 5 to 10 pounds of fruit on a plant at this point? 5 to 7 pounds?
To go about a month.
Is that a month to go?
Probably. They're picking several times a week. It's all for retail, so they're going through in the mornings, picking, loading on trucks, and then only taking red fruit. So I mean,
Yeah,
there's
you'll still need to keep.
significant income left.
Yeah, there's a significant amount of crop left there that you want to continue
They
pushing.
might be going well into October even.
Till frost, right?
As long as it's a high tunnel, so they
Yep. All right, so who has some thoughts they want to lead out with?
Was there a
Any?
fungicide applied that raised the coppers to be so high?
I'm sorry?
A fungicide?
Was there a fungus?
To have those coppers way off the scale
I would
in the balance in the leaves?
I would expect probably a copper bactericide or even a copper supplement. You guys would know better than I. It's not often that we find copper like a champ or a coside foliar applied show up in sap, but I guess it is possible. So, do you guys know what was being done?
I don't know for sure, but I do know that they had a regular program of pesticide use, so.
Yeah. I would expect that copper is probably being artificially inflated with a copper bactericide of some kind.
With the ammonical high, would that maybe also lead in that direction,
What high?
with the nitrogen?
Um,
Or is that more a white fly?
no, not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we would definitely increase molybdenum because that's one that you like a lot.
So, one recommendation for increasing moly. What's does anyone have kind of an aggregate sum overview that you want to start off with?
I think we have to get rid of ammonia first.
Okay. First step is okay. Magnesium, moly, sulfur, and nickel to address nitrates and to address the ammonium. I'm assuming that's why you're putting that on. And to why are you putting on the magnesium, sulfur, and moly?
Reduce ammonia.
Okay, so just as a point of clarification, magnesium, sulfur, and moly is not going to reduce ammonium, but it will reduce nitrates.
Okay.
But you do still need them.
So the nickel,
Well, the nickel will be for the ammonium application, for the high ammonium concentrations. Yes. Yep.
is there a cation deficiency again going on there? pH is a 5.6, 5.8.
Yep.
And it looks like the calcium and the potassium are both trending down. I mean, I see the calcium in the newer leaves going lower than the older leaves, and with that high ammonium, I'm guessing the photorespiration's going on, so we're getting more transpiration. Calcium's going to the older leaves, it's not making it to the top.
Very valid reasoning. I would absolutely address calcium. The other thing that I mentioned is that when you have high ammonium levels, it tends to suppress calcium absorption. So now it makes it even that much more critical to address calcium. So yes, you're definitely, I would address both calcium and potassium because they're both trending down and you have those acidic pHs.
And the fact that we see the potassium trending lower in the older leaves is more evidence that it's robbing potassium.
Right, it's pulling potassium out.
What's pulling the potassium? What's pulling
The potassium, because the potassium levels are lower in the older leaves. They're moving out of the lower leaves and moving up into the fruit and into the upper leaves.
So could you address that with the magnesium, or because of the situation in potassium, would you have to add additional potassium?
So you use the word magnesium, and just to clarify, they suggested addressing magnesium, sulfur, and boron, but magnesium is not going to manage potassium. It's the trace mineral manganese that does that. Manganese. Yeah.
Okay.
So would you guys consider addressing manganese?
We did, yeah. We increased.
Yep. I absolutely.
So then would you increase both?
I would increase both, particularly because now that they've described the situation, know the value of the crop, a retail crop. I mean, you can't afford not to do everything that you can to have the healthiest crop possible. So I would address both manganese and potassium in this case.
And is that supported by the cation deficiency idea? The pHs are kind of low?
Yes, pHs are low, and we want to increase the levels of both potassium and calcium to increase that plant sap pH.
Phosphorus is moderate, zinc's low. So again, that antagonism.
I don't think at this point that phosphorus is creating the zinc deficiencies, but I would definitely think we need to address zinc. And when we address zinc, that's very possible we may actually see an additional phosphorus response. Anyone else? Any additional thoughts?
Would you go with a soil and foliar potash?
question was, would we do both soil and foliar applications of potash? I would consider, yes, the short answer is yes, I would do both. And I like foliar applications because they produce an almost immediate response. But in the cases of a crop where you have a very heavy fruit load, obviously some fruit have already been harvested off this plant, but if we want this plant to continue all the way into October, then we need to maintain a viable root system as well. And you may need to put on substantial quantities of potassium, 5 to 10 pounds per acre per week, and that's too much to do in a foliar. So I would do that in the irrigation system. Yes, Rob?
Where you're adding calcium and potassium at the same time, do you see any antagonists there?
Not as long as they're both trending low as they are here. So when we talk about the antagonism is when we have one of them that's completely off the chart. So let's take, I want to come back to this one for just a moment, but I saw in this deck somewhere, I thought I saw a Honeycrisp apple sample. They're actually on the page just before. Page just in front. Oh my goodness. That's the first Honeycrisp apple sample I've ever seen in my life that didn't have excessive potassium. You said you too? Oh, you have two analysis? Yeah, these are the lowest potassium numbers I have seen. So no, usually what I'm talking about potassium calcium antagonism is when you have potassium levels that are, let's say, going back to this tomato sample, if you have potassium levels that are at 5,000 and 6,000 parts per million and calcium is at 2,000, that's when you start having the major problems, when you have that really wide spread. You need to have that spread narrowed up to be a lot closer. So there are significant differences in the calcium and potassium ratios between different crops, but for tomatoes, we don't see any problems with calcium deficiencies in the fruit until we go past about a 2.2 to 2.5 ratio. So right now, we're at a 1.9 ratio. I'm not too terribly concerned about it at this point. So,
John, I have calls all the time with high tunnel growers, tomatoes, and they have the yellow shoulders or the green shoulders.
yep,
Potassium.
it's a potassium deficiency, but it's not caused by a potassium deficiency. It's because potassium, the potassium thermostat isn't working, and there's high potassium in the leaves, but it's not moving into the fruit well. Why would that be? Because you have low levels of manganese. So again, what we're reporting here is we're saying that manganese is 14 and 17 parts per million. They're showing the bar graph as being on the low side of adequate. I don't think tomatoes have adequate manganese until they're at 20 parts per million. So I would put on a very substantial application of manganese onto this crop, and I would expect to see that yellow shoulder problem completely disappear. So there's a few that, there's one that nobody's mentioned yet. Iron. Iron is very deficient, and we definitely need to address iron. And so for one of the pieces, I'd just like to, I made a comment earlier that I thought I possibly might not have clarified. When we're talking about ammonium management, when you have these high levels of ammonium, the nickel application is a part of the management strategy, but it's just a part of it. In order for the nickel application to work, you have to be able to convert, you have to have the raw materials to convert ammonium back into protein. In order to do that, you have to have sugar. In order to have good sugar supply, you need to have good photosynthesis. So when we look at the minerals, I mentioned that, and I just made a passing comment that any foliar application that you put on has to address and make certain that all the minerals for photosynthesis are in adequate supply. Those are nitrogen, magnesium, iron, manganese, phosphorus. So all of those have to be adequate. And when we look at this profile, you've already mentioned that we need to address magnesium and manganese. So we need to address those. But the other critical missing element is iron. Right now, even with this test where it is right now, manganese and iron are the two lowest denominators. They are holding the plant back more than anything else at this point. So it doesn't matter if we do everything else that you guys recommended, but we don't address iron, we're not going to fix the ammonium problem. We're going to reduce the ammonium problem. If we put on everything else and we put on nickel, the ammonium problem is probably going to be cut by 50% or more, but we will still have some ammonium in the plant. We will not take it all the way down to a zero until we also address iron, and then it will go down very, very quickly. So, any other thoughts, questions on that SAP analysis report? All right, it's 3:30. You guys have got it all figured out? It's, what time was the day supposed to end? 4 o'clock? 4 o'clock. Yes, I will quickly review one of the apples. I'm surprised. All right, so if we go to the page just before the tomato sample, we have, it's also dated 8/17 for Honeycrisp apples. And so I'll review this as well. When we look at this sample, starting at the top, we're looking at having sugar levels 4.2, 6.5. The 6.5 number is on the upper end, and so my thoughts, when I look at this, I'm asking the question, okay, is this plant properly metabolizing sugar? Is there something going on that we potentially have sugar accumulation where sugars are not being transferred out of the leaves? I'm a little worried about that. I'm concerned that we have too much sugar accumulation in these older leaves. We look at pH. We have a pH of 5.8, 5.6, which would lead me to suspect that we may not have adequate levels of some of the cations. EC levels are good, 9.3, 9.6. Potassium, 3,400 and 3,600. And I'm very happy with where these numbers are with potassium on Honeycrisp apples. We have slightly higher levels on the older leaves, so I'm not concerned about running out of potassium. Let me see. This is dated 8/17, August 17. So when are Honeycrisp picked here in the area?
Second week of September.
So in a month from this point. I'm not concerned about these potassium levels yet, but I would be paying attention. I would be paying close attention to what's going on in the trees, and possibly in 2 weeks from now, a second SAP analysis might indicate that we may need more potassium applications. We don't need it yet at this point. Calcium levels, 1540 and 2140. Because we have a 2.2 to 1 calcium-potassium ratio, I would expect that these fruit at this stage are not really in a position of being susceptible to bitter pit problems. I'm not too worried about bitter pit at this profile. But I would, because I know of Honeycrisp's genetic tendency and their tendency towards bitter pit, I would be putting on foliar applications of calcium, just because I do not want that to ever become a problem with this crop. Magnesium levels, 1220 and 1010. Magnesium is one of these very mobile elements, and it's deficient in the old leaves right now. So I would definitely be addressing magnesium and putting on foliar applications of magnesium, medium to heavy application rates. Sodium levels are fine. If we look at ammonium, the ammonium levels are quite low, not completely at a zero, but they're low enough that I'm not really concerned about them, and nitrate levels are at an undetect. If we look at the total nitrogen, we have 135 and 120. And I would be concerned that potentially this is kind of right on the tipping edge of having, obviously, as you know very well, so there's a lot of discussion about concerns of having excessive nitrogen in the fruit. And one thing to understand is there's something very different between having nitrogen in the leaves and nitrogen in the fruit. The two are very different. They are not one and the same thing. And because this nitrogen is bordering on the low side on the leaves, I'm concerned that we might be losing some photosynthetic capacity. So I would consider putting on very small quantities of nitrogen in the form of urea. So I would prefer to avoid use of nitrate. So I would put in, would not take much. I'm talking fractions of a pound per acre. And just to see how the plants respond.
As a foliar?
As a foliar.
Okay.
Yeah. Or even better yet, if I don't know the full scope of the materials and the products that you guys use, but if you have an amino acid nitrogen, putting on an amino acid nitrogen would be golden at this point. Would be exactly what these plants are looking for.
What about a calcium nitrate?
I have hesitations around the use of calcium nitrate. I'm concerned about the nitrate application. It has too much potential. The nitrogen in this form at this stage has too much potential to rapidly move from the leaves into the fruit and cause us nitrate problems in the fruit, which is going to lead to bitter pit. We don't need that. I would prefer to avoid nitrate applications on Honeycrisp apples during the fruit fill period. You're much better off using another form of nitrogen. If we look at the chloride numbers are in range. Nothing to comment there. Sulfur levels are adequate. Phosphorus levels are trending. The graph shows that they are low on the new leaves, but the reality is that we have very high phosphorus levels on the old leaves. And so this plant seems to be signaling to us that it has a generous supply of phosphorus. We do not need to be applying any more. Silicon levels could stand to be higher, and that's really a function of biology. The iron levels are really low, and we have not yet identified why we have a blocker for the high sugar levels on those old leaves. I'm a little concerned about that. So we do need to address iron to increase photosynthesis and increase sugar production. We also, okay, here's what's going on. The manganese levels. The manganese levels are, remember, manganese is one of these elements that is moderately mobile. Deficiencies can show up in either the new leaves or in the old leaves first. Right now we have manganese deficiencies showing up in the old leaves. It's lower in the old leaves than it is in the new, and that is also why we have the sugar variable in the old versus the new. We have high sugar accumulations because we have manganese deficiencies in the old leaves. Do you guys know what a manganese deficiency looks like visually on the leaf? Okay, all of you know that? No, you don't? All right, so I mentioned that there are a number of elements which turn plant leaves really dark green. The primary ones are nitrogen, magnesium, and iron because of their involvement with chlorophyll production. Manganese also adds a green tinge to the rest of the leaf, but in particular, when you have low levels of manganese, the vein structure of the leaf itself will be dark green, but the veins will be lighter in color than the rest of the leaf. When you have adequate levels of manganese, the veins will be darker than the rest of the leaf. So that's one of the pieces that you can look at to evaluate manganese imbalances in the plant very quickly, visually, while you're in the field. Then the zinc levels are really low, and we have zinc deficiencies on the new growth. So zinc also needs to be addressed. Because of concerns about calcium in the fruit for this variety, I would also address boron. Boron is slightly on the low side. And copper seems to be adequate. And I would also, I think they have nitrate at an undetect here. So you wouldn't think that you need a lot of molybdenum levels, but I know that for apples you're going to need moly in the neighborhood of about 0.15 to 0.2 parts per million. So I would address molybdenum here, even though it's not showing up as being deficient, and even though we don't have a lot of nitrates. So just to summarize this, a foliar application at this stage would include calcium. I would not supply potassium. I would put on calcium and boron, and I would put on magnesium and molybdenum. We could put on sulfur if you have a product that contained those three in combination, which is one of the things that we do. We put on magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum in combination, and so you could add sulfur, but you don't particularly need to. But definitely magnesium and molybdenum need to be addressed, and the trace minerals, iron and manganese and zinc, need to be addressed. You need to address those three traces. So that is kind of an overview of foliar recommendation that I would make for this crop.
John, go over that molybdenum demoly again. What? You said it's not low.
Yeah, I said it is low.
Oh, it is low.
It is low. They don't have a bar graph on these Honeycrisp apples, but the desired values would be about 0.2 parts per million, and we're at about half that. So I would address molybdenum. And the reason my comment was that the nitrates are at a none detect. So if you look just at the nitrates, you would suspect that you may not need additional molybdenum, but I think you do need additional molybdenum just to manage this plant well. This is on soybeans, orchid trees. Yeah, thanks for putting that up there, Eric. All right, so what questions do you guys have? Do you have any questions we can ask? We can talk about anything that we talked about today or anything that we didn't talk about. It's just wide open.
Do you have any opinion or comments to make on why the Honeycrisp leaves later in the season start to turn yellow and more?
Have the chlorosis? I don't. And Eric and I were reviewing some data from an experiment that he conducted several years ago where he pulled tissue analysis from the same trees on leaves that had chlorosis and leaves that didn't. And the very simple summary of that tissue analysis is that the leaves that had chlorosis had approximately 30 to 40% less trace minerals and less calcium, less potassium. It was a surprising difference. They had substantially less nutrient content almost across the board than the dark green leaves. And so I don't really know the full details of why that was the case, but one of the pieces that we discussed is this next growing season collecting some of those leaf samples side by side from the same trees and conducting sap analysis on them and trying to understand what the differences are and what's happening and what's going on. So I suspect, I don't know this for certain, but I suspect that possibly the plants may be pulling some of the mobile elements from these leaves and moving them into the fruit. Particularly, they may be pulling proteins. They may be actually pulling protein out as protein and moving protein into the fruit. That would fit the mineral profile changes and differences that were in the tissue analysis that Eric gave me this morning. But that's simply a hypothesis at this point. I don't know whether that's actually the case or not.
Doesn't it seem to happen more with a lighter crop? Or am I wrong on that? See more of those yellow?
I haven't noticed that. I think research has shown that what's happening is carbohydrates are being trapped in the leaves and it's not moving out.
Really?
Isn't that?
Okay.
So what would be the element that's increasing
I mean,
mobility?
potassium and boron are directly associated with carbohydrate transport. I wonder if it would be possible to remediate it with aggressive applications of boron. One of the things that we do we do this on potatoes and a number of different crops, is when we want them to mature very quickly, we'll put and move sugars and move carbohydrates into the fruit. We will put on a foliar application of boron, very aggressive foliar application of boron. And it triggers very rapid and aggressive carbohydrate transport where all the sugars move out of the leaves and into the fruit, and we trigger senescence very quickly with a strong boron application. So that might be something to consider in moving these sugars out of the leaves. I don't know for certain, but it would be something to look at.
How about sun scald or sunburn on fruit?
Sun scald and sunburn on a number of different crops tends to often be associated with manganese levels. And the short answer, yeah, it's a long explanation of why it happens, but the short answer is that it's associated with manganese deficiencies. Yep. We had a question or a comment over here as well.
What, as far as applying a foliar cobalt, what would that do with your ammonium levels?
In our experience, foliar applications of cobalt have not made a big difference in and of themselves. Even with, when we had this problem in the tomato high tunnels, all these high tunnels were already applying and addressing cobalt, and we still had the problems with high ammonium. I think that it definitely helped, but it wasn't the solution that was needed in total. There's a number of different, there's an additional comment that I would have about cobalt. I know there's a few grape growers here, and actually there's probably no table grape production here. It's all wine grapes, I would assume, right? Yeah, okay, good. I know that very cobalt applications as a foliar at maturity on table grapes will take the blush off of fruit. And I suspect that possibly it might even do the same thing for apples, although I don't know that for certain. Although I would guess that it would take a lot more. So unless you guys have any additional thoughts or questions, I'm going to, yep.
Could you review again why you suggest a urea application on this Honeycrisp as opposed to a nitrate application?
Because of the metabolism process and the way that they're metabolized inside the plant. When you apply nitrates to the foliage, a couple of different pieces happen, but the primary one that I'm most concerned about is that there is the distinct possibility, particularly on the leaves close to the fruit, that the nitrates could migrate from the leaves into the fruit in the nitrate form before it's converted to amino acids. And if that happens, that is going to really drive fruit quality problems in bitter pit, because that nitrate is going to drive very aggressive cell expansion at the expense of cell integrity. And you can really drive bitter pit problems with nitrate application. So I strongly prefer urea so that the nitrogen goes into the fruit in the amine or the amino acid form. That's my preference, my reason for that preference.
Another question kind of related to that. One of the recommendations for strawberries is a late application in late fall with urea to address nitrogen issues in the spring. Again, what do you think there? Is urea a better form of nitrogen in that situation also?
So it's less problematic because you're not trying to fill fruit, but what you're trying to do on strawberries is you're trying to get a tremendous amount of cell initiation, a lot of cell division in that embryo during the bud initiation stage that is eventually going to become a strawberry. Because the reality is that, I discussed this earlier, strawberries as a drupe, that all those cells are already divided and already formed when the bud is initiated, not when it blooms. I mean, when you have a strawberry blossom, what is eventually going to be the fruit is already present. It's already there. You're pollinating the seeds, but you're not actually pollinating what is going to be the fruit itself. So,
But John, but this is really late in the fall. You know, almost before the plants are going in, just before they go into dormancy.
Okay.
Applying nitrogen, not to initiate food production, but as a storage of nitrogen for the following year.
okay. You had a comment, Dol?
It actually is right after dormancy begins, but before they tend to lay down.
Okay.
Because at that point, they no longer will absorb it, but at the early dormancy stage, they will absorb the urea and store it in the crown for use in the spring. Is what Cornell University is at
Right.
5 pounds per acre.
Okay, so it's not a very intense application.
They say that's better than 30 pounds in the spring.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And so I would prefer urea there instead of nitrate for the same reason that I talked about with the Honeycrisp. They would take it in better and they will store it in a form that is not going to antagonize calcium during the bud initiation period. And so the very important part is, the comment that Del just made about 5 pounds of nitrogen in the fall outperforming 30 pounds of nitrogen in the spring, I would say, based on my experience in producing really firm and large-sized strawberry fruit, a pound of calcium absorbed by the plants in the fall is going to outperform 10 pounds absorbed by the plants in the spring. You cannot, when you have a strawberry crown where the plant does not have adequate levels of calcium, the same is true of potassium to a degree as well, but particularly true of calcium. Once calcium is deficient in a strawberry crown in the spring, when you're trying to fill fruit, you will never ever catch up. It doesn't matter how much calcium you put on. You just can't seem to catch up. And when that happens, you will see the later set of fruit drop in fruit size very, very rapidly. You lose a lot of poundage and a lot of fruit as a result of that.
One other question. Sodium on raspberries, increased firmness.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a valid treatment?
be very careful. Sodium, raspberries are very sensitive to sodium. If you want to improve firmness on raspberries, I would say that calcium boron manganese is going to be your greatest asset, because potassium, adequate potassium supply and moving nutrients and water into the fruit is also going to give you very strong turgor pressure. You don't need sodium and chloride to get strong turgor pressure when you have adequate levels of potassium and these other elements. So the point that I was trying to make is that sodium and chloride can contribute in this way, but you're not dependent on them. You don't have to have them. You can accomplish that result simply by managing the calcium-potassium exchange. Yep. One more question. Yep.
Is there a good time to add any of these nutrients to ensure good yeast assimilable nitrogen in the fruit to where it goes in? This is more of a concern for us who make wine, because to complete a fermentation healthy, you want this nitrogen in the fruit, but I don't know, aside from some training methods, how to get it there. Is there a nutrient that we could apply?
I want to make sure that I'm understanding your question correctly. Are you saying that you want to achieve higher levels of nitrogen in the fruit, in the berries at harvest?
Yes.
And you're having a challenge accomplishing that?
In the form of yeast assimilable nitrogen, so that the yeast can then put it to work and ferment.
What can you help me understand what defines yeast assimilable? Is it amino acid form?
It's above my head. Or is there a way to ensure a healthy, just nitrogen in general in the fruit?
There are absolutely ways to increase the protein content in the berry.
Okay.
Yeah, that is not that difficult. It could be an interesting challenge to see what form that would be in, and you can also moderate that to a degree, but there's less flexibility, less fluidity there. Yep.
Quick search: yeast assimilable nitrogen is free amino nitrogen, a combination of free amino nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. So what would be it?
Thank you, Google. So it would be my expectation that the ammonium nitrogen would probably be as a result of protein degradation, or as you can't really transport ammonium directly into a fruit from the leaves without causing severe fruit degradation and loss of fruit quality. So I don't think that is happening. So the short answer is what you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to increase the protein concentration of the berry, and that's not that difficult to accomplish. The two pieces that you need to do that are obviously need to supply adequate levels of nitrogen late on during just the final 2 weeks or so before harvest. And it will not take much. Again, I would prefer to use the urea form at a half a pound to a couple pounds per acre is all that you're going to need. And possibly also to ensure that you have good protein synthesis, depending on what amino acids you're looking for, cysteine and methionine and so forth, you may want to add just a touch of sulfur. Now, don't try that, only try that on a few plants and test it out first, because I have no idea how that's going to affect the taste.
Okay.
So be forewarned.
Thanks.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Eric. I'd like Eric, if you could just talk a little bit about sample collection and transmission throughout the growing season, how we operate that process.
Sure. I've been taking samples both from strawberries, apples, tomatoes last year, and some of the key points, the guide that Crop Health Labs puts out, or the folks in the Netherlands put out, is quite detailed and helpful. Some of the main points are to avoid sending wet leaves. We've had leaves break down in transit in the hot vehicles. When you do dry leaves, dry them by blotting them with a paper towel, not rubbing them or abrading the surface at all if you can avoid that. It's better to leave the leaves dirty than to try and brush off surface dirt, because you'll damage the leaves typically, and then the sap pressure changes as it evaporates or condenses on the inside of the bags. Other than careful handling, everything is pretty straightforward as far as the guides go. You differentiate between the young and the old depending on the structure of the plant you're sampling. Pack the leaves nicely in the bag, stacked as opposed to just crunched up. And when you do ship them, you'll want to put them in an insulated bag of some kind, and then I just find whatever generic version of these are on sale at the grocery store, throw them in the freezer, and these juice pouches make a wonderful ice packet for shipment. And it's cheaper than anything you're likely to find specialty from a mailing service or something. These bags are insulated. You can find them between $1, $3 at Target or any of the big box stores, usually in the freezer section at the end of the aisles. And then I was sending a dozen or more samples at a time, and a large FedEx box handles one of these. I put the individual sandwich bags or the plastic bags the samples are packed in inside this bag. Take your frozen juice pouches, put them in a paper grocery bag, fold it up so you're not getting direct ice contact on the leaves. Put it all together, fold it over, and then slide it into the FedEx box, and it should keep for a couple days in transit. We haven't had a problem since we settled on this procedure. So that's basically all I have for.
You handle the leaves barehanded, or do you wear gloves?
Usually barehanded, but I wash my hands first, and if it's warm and I'm sweating, it's not so much what's on the surface of the leaf, I think. They're less sensitive than a tissue test from sweat off your brow or the type of container you collect it in. Good hygiene is always appreciated, I'm sure.
And when you sample, were you mostly 9 o'clock before 9 o'clock, or what was your time
Yes.
frame?
On rare occasions when it was overcast, I might push that a little bit, but generally on a nice day, if you don't have your samples collected by the time photosynthesis is really starting to roll, your results are going to be more confusing possibly than helpful. So you might even consider pushing the sample off a week or whatever the next collection time is.
Is it okay to collect and store them in the refrigerator until later in the day?
That's an option. If we have on occasion sent samples direct to the Netherlands because we missed a pickup, and we kept the samples cool. They were dry to begin with, and we didn't hear reports of any problems with that process. It added to the cost considerably, but
Talk about the volume and the size of the bag, plastic bag.
as I recall, 0.2 of a pound is a typical leaf sample size, and that varies. You might have half a dozen large tomato leaves. You might have 25 or 40 strawberry leaves. It runs the gamut. You basically want a volume of leaf material that's 100 milliliters or 0.2 of a pound. And that should, you might find that the little bags that you get aren't quite large enough. I sometimes use Ziploc freezer bags, a little larger, more durable.
What days of the week do you send those? Can you use overnight postage as opposed to Federal Express? Or what days do you need them to send to the Netherlands? Or how does that work?
I know that the post office no longer guarantees overnight delivery for anything. So you either have to go UPS or FedEx if you need an overnight delivery. I hesitate to stretch any delivery over 2 days to Ohio because it also has to be processed there and reshipped to the Netherlands. If you can afford it or can find have FedEx pick your sample up, that's the surest way to get the leaves there in best condition. It's not cheap necessarily, but if you can make a run, get an account with FedEx so that you get a little bit of a discount there. Probably the most economical and best way to get the product there in good shape. I'm open to suggestions in that regard too.
I don't know if I heard the first part of your, have you washed the leaves?
I don't wash the leaves.
Don't
If
wash.
if the leaf surface is dusty, that's not a significant problem as I understand it. If they're wet, you don't want to pack them in the plastic bags wet. They will break down if the temperatures get above a certain point, and it happens fast. So blot them dry, don't rub them dry. And don't air dry them like with heat in a fan or something. You'll change the sap concentration too much.
So Eric, I want to do leaf testing this season. How do I get in touch with Agro K to get that done?
I'm thinking you know the answer to that.
I want everybody to know that answer.
What I mean is maybe, Del, do you want to speak to that? Or?
Well, the process is when you want to order samples for the year or for whatever, and generally we're doing it every 2 weeks, and it depends a little bit on the crop, what the time frame is. Then you would contact us, and Eric and I have been working with that end of it, and we will order the labels then from the crop health labs, and they will send you out a set of labels and the information, and maybe John, you can add to that, but then it will give the instructions, and you just kind of proceed on from there.
So if I want to order, let's say, 6 tests,
Yep.
they're going to send me all 6 at one time?
Right.
So what you should think about is what you want to do for your crop
Right.
for the season.
6 sets of 2 of the
6
whole
to 2, right.
variety.
Young and
Young and old.
Yeah, very, very important comment, Larry, is that when we look at it's unlike tissue analysis. With tissue analysis, when you see a problem, something isn't going well, you can walk out to a laboratory, pull a sample, or walk out to the field, pull a sample, ship it to the laboratory, they'll run the analysis and send you a report and send you an invoice 2 weeks later. Crop health labs and no crop control laboratory in the Netherlands does not operate in that way. That is not their business model, and they point blank refuse to operate in that way. If you send samples, if you become a multiple violator and send samples to them in that way multiple times, they will stop giving you reports. So their business, the way they have structured it is that they want you to make a commitment that you will measure this crop throughout the entire growing season. So you need to begin, their entire system is completely automated and computerized. So they want you to identify that you're going to select, or you're going to test this variety of apples on this field 6 times throughout the growing season, or 8 times, or whatever the number is. And when you place that order, they will send you barcoded labels that are barcoded to that field, that variety, your name and address, and everything is behind that barcode. So now you have a set of 6 new leaf barcodes, 6 old leaf barcodes that you can use throughout the entire growing season. And now when that sample gets to the laboratory, they simply scan the barcode and run it through the process. They don't do that. They process thousands of samples a day, and they simply refuse to put in manually the addresses and the contact information, all the details for those during the growing season. They want all that done in spring, in advance, before the rush season ever happens. So that's the process for that.
So we're talking about planning now, guys. We're all talking about planning if we're going to do this. Go ahead.
Your intent is to get this equipment over in this country?
At some point, yes, as soon as possible.
Not this year?
Not this year, not this growing season.
So if we send you a sample, it will take between 5 and 8 days to get the results.
Yes.
Once we get the results, we'll have to, how do we get the recommendations? As we get to Agro K?
You figured out from what you've learned here today.
That's what I'm afraid of. We just had the whole course.
And then we're going to hold your hand.
Ways to get it wrong.
We're going to hold your hand.
You call us, and then if we're in trouble, we'll call John or someone over.
So, but then we have to make an application within a few days, because we need to get another sample out within 2 weeks from the time we got the first one, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so can we expect a response after 2 days, 3 days after the?
Oh, with Agro K products, yeah,
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Are you asking, will you see a plant response from a foliar application in a couple of days?
Yes.
Without question.
So that's, but it has to be made at least a day or two before you take the sample.
And if you,
Well, but the reality, if I could just add to that, the reality is that it isn't, the alignment isn't going to be perfect, and it may not work out that way. Maybe it works out that you put on a foliar application, and you're putting it out of sync, out of perfect synchronization with your tissue or sap analysis collection, but you're still able to monitor the trends, and you're still able to make adjustments, but you might be making adjustments 5 days after the last application, something like that, instead of being perfect alignment. But it'll still work very well.
you're still probably 3 weeks ahead of the game versus tissue testing.
Yeah, you're still so far ahead that you're preventing any problems long before they show up.
I would recommend though that if you plan on sampling a block to try and schedule your sprays to avoid conflicts with sample collection, just when they're wet with whatever product, it does stand a chance of contaminating the sample enough to make a difference.
So, completely different question, but it almost sounds like compounding in a way, nutrients, as we get these.
Oh.
Does Agro K have products available in separate containers, for instance, where you can have mangoes available for us to pour into our tanks?
It is available.
That way?
It's available, and certainly.
They all are available. Everything that John has talked about,
Okay.
combinations, either calcium alone, calcium with boron, or calcium with moly.
Yeah.
All of those combinations are.
Okay. Are you going to then be giving us a little hand holding again, some sort of?
We will still develop a program for you.
Yeah.
And we probably prefer you follow that program and use the SAP testing to monitor, is this program working? Is this program doing what I expect it to do? And so that's why we want to start early, so we have plenty of time to work it, to make it fit.
So we get there, we have the hands.
Exactly. If there's something that's not right. Right. And sometimes it's weather related. It's a problem that we're trying to release that stress on that tree so that that plant can continue to function at its full potential.
Very well. Thank you guys for coming today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was productive, and look forward to seeing some of your sap analysis results this summer. So have fun.